everyone, and welcome to Untamed Unfiltered. I'm Amanda Nicholson.
And I am Aaron Provencio, and today we are joined by two of the center's wildlife rehabilitators, Kelsey Pleasants and Shannon Mazurowski. How's it going today?
Doing well. How are you?
Good, good. Thanks for joining us.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for joining us today as we take a deeper dive into our last episode of Untamed after the release. And you guys were both in this episode of Untamed, but we knew when we sat down to kind of take our deeper dive into the episode, we knew we wanted to talk to wildlife rehabilitators because that's really what your job is all about, right? Is getting these patients back where they belong.
Yeah, absolutely. That's obviously the end goal and what we hope for with every patient that comes in. With wildlife rehab in general, our whole goal is to rehabilitate those sick, injured, and orphan patients and release them back into the wild where they can thrive and find their own food and shelter and mates and really just, survive on their own out there.
Yeah, we all enjoy working with the animals while they're with us, but our favorite parts are definitely when they leave us and go back to the wild.
And there's naturally, as rehabilitators, there's different criteria that you look at per species, per individual even, that helps you decide when that animal is ready for release. And naturally, the criteria for releasing an osprey is different than a box turtle, is different than a bear. Would you mind kind of walking us through those different qualifiers that allow you to understand, like, yes, this individual is ready to be released back into the wild?
Yeah, of course. It's obviously very individualized per species, and there's such a variety of what we do. So we rehab so many different birds, and each of those birds has a different requirement based off of their natural history. The same thing with mammals. So for example, we have a lot of baby possums right now. I think we have like 40 baby possums. So these guys, looking at their natural history, when they're with mom, they're hanging on to her back once they emerge from their pouch for, they're in her pouch for 2 months. They come out, hang on her back for about 2 more months. At that time, they start to become a little more independent. When they den up for the night, they might come off with mom and go with her to forage, but they're always still together up until they're a certain point of age or size. So we look for them to get about 400 to 500 grams, which is about the size that they go and disperse from mom naturally. And at that point, we want them to be able to do everything that they would be doing in the wild with her. So we want them to be able to go off and forage and go through those leaf piles and find those bugs. They're semi-arboreal when they are younger, so not as much when they're older. So when they're younger, we want to make sure they're climbing well. They can navigate different sizes of trees and branches, and kind of those ones that are a little more pliable. So when they step on it, maybe they're going to fall a bit. We want them to be able to grab and use their tail and hang on. We want to just make sure they have that appropriate fear of us, so they shouldn't see us as any sort of food source any longer. They should be finding their own. So when we go up there, we want to make sure that they're exhibiting those behaviors of fear towards us and kind of opening their mouths and running away from us. That's just one example. Do you have any others?
I think that one thing that some people forget to consider is social structure. So we consider that pretty heavily when we release certain species. Obviously, some are more independent than others, but we recently released a couple of cliff swallows, and in order to release them, we had to make sure that, first of all, we were finding the appropriate habitat for them, but also we had to go on birding websites and see if there were hotspots for any birds in that area so that they actually had a colony to live with. And there's several species that we have to consider that with. Like, we have a few crows that we need to release, but we want to release them together because they're also a more social species. So there's a lot more that goes into consideration when releasing an animal than just, one factor.
Yeah, and something else too with birds. I think birds are, for me, the most fun to assess when they're ready for release because they have kind of a lot more specialized natural histories and requirements to be able to be released. So we just had a peregrine falcon that we actually sent off with biologists to be hacked out because it was young. But a peregrine falcon versus a red-tailed hawk, a red-tail should be able to take off easily, from the ground. And it really doesn't take that much to get them to flight condition while they're in our flight cages. All of our flight cages are linear, so we just push them back and forth kind of in a line, and they turn around in the cage. And they're pretty good about getting off of the ground and maintaining that height. But a peregrine is required to be a very strong flyer. They're a bit more of a heavy-bodied bird than a red tail or a broadwing or a Cooper's hawk. And they do a lot of aerial maneuvering. So for them, it's a lot more difficult to be exercised in a flight pen, and they require kind of specialized conditioning to make sure that they are of proper stamina and endurance and able to navigate their flight patterns that they need to be able to be released. So they're a bit more of a challenge for that, deciding when or not they're able to be released.
I was wondering actually if I could touch on a point that you just made when you were talking about the possums, this idea of a proper fear of humans. I think that's kind of interesting because a lot of people don't necessarily take that into account when they look at work that you all do as wildlife rehabilitators, because not only do you have to make sure that they're physically healed, but also behaviorally ready to be returned to the wild. And especially you two, there's a video on our YouTube channel of you two earlier in the year with the bear cubs that we have right now. There's a bunch of comments and people saying, oh my gosh, that's the best job ever. Oh my gosh, I would love to be a bear mom and stuff. But being a rehabilitator to wild animals is interesting because as much as, you care about these animals and care for these animals, there's also that fine line you have to toe of making sure that they don't get too attached to you and vice versa, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it differs again based off of what species we're with. So for example, those bear cubs, I was speaking to our biologist one day and she used terms that I think I've hung on to since then. The bear cubs, they acclimate to us as those food givers and they're used to us, but they're not necessarily habituated to us. So if you, Erin, were to go up to our bear complex and see our cubs right now, they would do what we call stranger danger, and they would run away and go up trees and chuff at you and be scared. And that's what we want to see. But when we go up there, they're like, oh, you are going to give me food and that is what I want. So they might come up to the fence and kind of see us more as something that others would perceive as it being cute and oh, they're friendly with them, and that's not what we're aiming for at all. We definitely want all of our animals to have an appropriate fear and appropriate behavior towards humans. Wildlife should never be cuddly or fun to be around or any sort of associated with the behaviors of domestic animals. So it is kind of a fine line we toe, making sure that we're seen just as the caregivers and not as a, source of something they want to be around.
Yeah, and I think that ties back into release, as we always, that's our ultimate goal, is to get things back out into the wild. And for me, I'd rather, you always get at least somewhat attached to the animals you're caring for because you're putting so much time and resources into it. But I'm happier when I see that they're slightly afraid of me or just don't want to seek comfort in a human, because then I know that they get to go back where they belong versus potentially ending up in captivity or not making it back out at all. So I think that having that fear of humans is much more of a comforting thought for rehabilitators than, wanting to be around us.
Yeah, so lots of work to get animals ready for release. I feel like in many ways it's like you guys are aiming for that goal and starting to get them ready for release from the minute that they come in, whether it's getting them just healthy again or old enough to survive on their own and getting all of those skills that they need to get back out there. So just lots of work and tons to consider based on species and time of year and all of that. But after the release, you guys put all of this work into getting these patients out there, and we hope for the best. We hope that we gave them the skills they need, but we don't always necessarily know what happens from the moment they leave us. But we explored in this episode a few different ways where we can get some information. And we know, of course, it's not necessarily practical to do post-release monitoring for all sorts of patients, because that, some of it comes down to what technology is available, what's safe for a particular species or particular age of the specific species. A lot of it comes down to money too, because some of that can get pretty pricey as well. But we kind of hammered on 3 different ways that we at the center have tapped into some of that information through bird banding, ear tagging bears, and then GPS transmitters as well. So I want to just kind of run through the 3 of those things as well. So in thinking about bird banding, Maz, in the episode you shared a couple of examples of like a screech owl band report that we got back in. Do you guys have any other stories or experiences that you've had with birds that have been banded before?
I mean, we do have them come in occasionally where they have bands and we have to report that. I think we had a royal tern come in recently that was banded, and then we could look up exactly where it came from, and I think it was banded at hatch, so you could also tell how old it was. Unfortunately, the band return rate is pretty low, so we don't get a ton of reports back on that, but when we do get it, it is interesting because then we can see where they came from and how long they've survived for and all of that information.
Yeah, I kind of always think that's really interesting, of like just waiting for their band report of like, where was this bird born? And like, oh my gosh, it's 7 years old. I don't know, it just makes them somehow that much more interesting just to key into what their lives have been like.
We got a bird in, Amanda, maybe you remember this because I think you were a part of knowing when it came in. I don't remember if it was a bald eagle or something that had a band, but we were able to look that up, and it was like 30 years old, the bird that came in.
Yes, Ed tells this story of like Ed tells a story of a bald eagle that was banded, and something about like they had a hard time reading the band, and yeah. I don't know, they reported it, but sometimes getting information takes a while. It's not necessarily an instantaneous thing. And I remember for the story he tells, they got the information back on that bird's release day, so it had been with us all this time. And on that day, they found out that it was something like 30 years old, close to 30, which is amazing. Like, that's just so cool.
I think that's really cool. And I think, I mean, as Matt said, we don't get a lot of those band returns back from birds, which in a way is like a bit of a bummer, because we would love to know, especially for those patients that we've spent a long time rehabilitating, what exactly happens to them. But you could also take that in a positive light, because sometimes, or most of the times when we do get those band returns, it's not often a great outcome. They've either died of just natural causes, or maybe they were hit by a car or something. So I will choose to look at it in the light of like, if I don't get a band return, then that bird is hopefully thriving and doing well by itself after rehabilitation.
Yeah, kind of the no news is good news sort of outlook on it.
Yeah.
And speaking of hearing about patients after release, Kelsey also talked about in this episode ear tagging on bears that we release. And like you were saying, we don't often always hear back about our release patients, but we recently heard back about one of these. Is that right?
Yeah, we did. We got the most exciting news. Someone sent us photos of a bear that we had released a few years ago in an area actually not too far from the center. So to me, that's even cooler that it's more of a like local story, if you will. But it was a female cub that we had raised here and released. And years later, she has returned to that property with 3 babies. So she is thriving and obviously doing really well out there. So that just warms my heart as a bear mom to know that, you know, what we're doing does work, and they are thriving out there.
And really, that makes you a grandmother.
Oh man. Yeah, that's probably that is the first time.
Yeah, I know.
Congratulations.
Yeah, she looked great in the photos that we saw. It was really exciting to see that.
And we've seen a few other cubs that people have sent in photos. Well, they were yearlings after. There was a man a couple of years ago who has a tree in his yard that fruits, and one of our released yearlings would come back and eat the fruit out of his tree. And so that was really good to see as well. But this is the first with babies, so that was super exciting.
And the third thing that we talked about in this episode was actually a short little segment that I did, was talking about eagle tracking through GPS transmitters, which really is a more active way of following patients, because we just get this information and we can practically watch them move around. So over the years, we've been able to fit about 24 transmitters on eagle patients, not something that we can do a lot because they're not our transmitters. So kind of beholden to others and the people who have the funding for that sort of thing. But I personally have loved watching the tracking updates from those patients, because it's been, 24 birds that's a number of eagles. And in a lot of cases, nearly all of the cases, like they've gone on to live for years, and until we just don't get tracking reports anymore, typically because the transmitter's batteries have worn out. On a couple of cases, we've seen that the bald eagles have died, but yet in a lot of those cases, it's been like months after release, so that we know they've gone on to do great things. I talked in this episode about 2 birds that I just really have enjoyed tracking, which were 2 hatchier birds released in August of 2017. And they went on to like bop around Virginia and do their thing. And then the summer following their release, they started making annual summer trips up to Quebec, Canada. The thing I didn't get to share, which is really sad, so I'm gonna be a downer, but actually the day that I filmed that Untamed segment, I talked about these birds, and I walked back into my desk to an email from one of the tracking people who said, ooh, based on the lack of movement from this transmitter, we think this bird, who's gone to Quebec back and forth, we think this bird is dead. And like, I literally just gushed about this bird on camera, but it looked like from the tracking that bird had died in Virginia, which is really sad. And we weren't able to recover the body, but yet again, that was almost 3 years post-release, which is like, that bird did go out there, and we were able to give it the skills that it needed to go and be successful. So I guess, I'm just wondering like what your impressions are. I'm sure you guys don't always get to like log into the website and see what's going on out there, but just what does it mean to you that these birds can go be normal eagles?
I love it. I see those updates when you post them, and they show up on Facebook, and that always just, I get so excited, because eagles in particular are ones that can be kind of a lot of work in the rehab process, especially when they're babies, to get them to learn how to be an eagle. And I worry a lot as a rehabber when I have a bird come in that should have still been in the nest and should have had all of this time for the parents to teach it how to be an eagle, how to do eagle things. Like, are we going to do it good enough of a service? Are we going to be good enough of rehabbers to be able to teach this bird, like, this is the food you're looking for and this is how you get it? And will we be setting it up for success basically post-release? So those stories of the eagles that we have been able to release that came in as fledglings or younger, that we then released and are thriving after, just, that solidifies that what we're doing is working and is positive. And hopefully all those birds that don't go out with transmitters are having the same fate, where they're able to live and survive for years after release.
Yeah. It's one of my favorite things to get information back about birds that we did release, because like Kelsey said, then we know we're doing the right thing. I think if we had unlimited time and resources, then we'd put a transmitter on everything that we sent out the door. Unfortunately, that's not a reality, but yeah, that's definitely one of the best things to hear as a rehabber.
And I should say, I looked yesterday that the other bird who made that annual trip is back in Quebec, Canada. So that bird left like last week, and I checked on it and it was in Vermont. And then I looked yesterday and it's like back It loves the St. Lawrence River. It goes back to the same area. This is now the third summer that it's
So
gone
maybe
up.
there's a mate
Maybe.
and little nestlings and fledglings out there from this bird. That would be exciting.
Yeah, and I can't remember, I think I must have been one of those two birds, but I definitely held one of those birds as they were being fit with the backpack, and that might be the best arm workout I've ever gotten in my life, because you have to hold them out flat like this because they're working on their back. Yeah, it was really interesting to watch them do that whole process too, and then be able to see them go out the door with that.
Over the years, I mean, every year you all see thousands of patients, literally thousands, which is crazy. And I know that it's probably a difficult question for us to ask you. What's your favorite one of everyone that you've ever seen? What's your favorite? But I'm curious if you've been able to be a part of a patient's release or go see a patient's release that stands out to you all in a way that sort of is above the rest.
I think for me, and this is probably the answer, I don't know if people would expect this answer, but it was a bear release for me. So the bears are ones that we put a lot of our heart into, a lot of our resources, our time, energy, sweat, literally everything. And they're a long-term commitment for us. We keep them for a year to a year and a half. It's a really long time. And being able to go last year, I was invited by the game department to go, and I got to go on 7 releases with the Cubs, and there were ones that I was able to raise from bottle babies all the way through to release. And so to be able to see them go out there and, we have them in a wooded area at the center, and so there's not like a field of grass. And so one was released in a field of grass right next to a wooded area. And as soon as it put its feet down, it didn't know what it was. And it was like holding its little legs up every time. And then it stood up on its back legs, and it kind of just looked around and like gathered its surroundings. And actually a week post-release, one of the biologists sent us photos from a trap camera of that one. We released 2 bears there. So one of those bears had come back to forage for food in that same spot and was photographed. So I got to actually see it again after watching it be released in that same spot. So for me, I think that's a memory I will always keep, because there's just so much that went into it, and to be able to see it come full circle from admission to release, and then knowing that it was still doing okay a week later out there really meant a lot.
There's several releases that I've gotten to be a part of over the years that have been great. Certainly the bears, going to those releases was amazing, but probably some of my favorites are when I'm able to engage people not in the field of wildlife. I've invited certain family members to releases before, and I can talk for hours about the things I'm passionate about, namely their birds. But when people actually want to hear me talk about it, and they can actually see that animal go back to where it belongs, it's probably my favorite part, because then I can spread the message of wildlife should be where it belongs, and also look at this cool thing that's out here now, like living the life that it should be living. And especially when it's a species that people aren't super fond of, probably like possums, for instance. Before I started working at the center, I don't think that anybody in my life knew anything about possums or really thought that they were cute or, anything but scary. But now my family will text me and be like, hey, I saw a possum in my yard, and, I maintained my distance. I respect them now, even though they're not my favorite animal. I understand them a little better because you talk about them so much. So just engaging people outside of this field in wildlife through releases is some of my favorite parts.
What about you, Erin? I know that you have not put in the work to get patients ready for release. But you've been able to be there for the glory of release, right? Like you've done some releases in your time here. Some of them on Facebook Live.
I've done a couple releases. I've been a part of a couple releases that some have gone better than others, but they've all been successful, just different measures. I actually really identify with what Shannon just said, in that I was able to go to a bald eagle release we did a few weeks ago. Golly, time is passing very fast and also very slow. And it was really cool because it was the same kind of thing where there were people there at this release event who weren't necessarily in any way connected to the field of conservation like we are. And to be able to engage them in conversations, not just about the eagle itself, but about what it means to have it return to the wild and all these things, from adults all the way to a young kid that was there as well. It was just cool to be able to have that, to use this cool release event to start a conversation about these bigger conservation goals was really, really special to me, because as an outreach person, but as somebody who cares, it was really special to be able to have those conversations and also see it in real life, also watch that bird take off into the wild again.
Yeah.
What about you, Amanda?
Oh man. One of the releases that I got to be a part of that stands out to me is, it's going to sound the opposite of what Aaron and Maz just said, of like, you guys are like, involving other people is so great, which obviously it really is. But one of my standout releases was way back when, it was either when I was a student or like a brand new staff member eons ago. And I was able to release a red-tailed hawk close to the center, just up off of the top of the mountain. And it was just me. And this bird didn't want to leave the box at first. So like it took a few minutes and it was just like waiting. And it was just, I don't know, something about it was just extremely quiet and no fanfare, like no crowd, no attention, whatever. And it's so beautiful up there on top of the mountain too. And when this bird finally got himself together and took off, he just like, it was just a clear shot and like soaring for quite a long time. So it was just like very picturesque, but I think it was such a quiet moment too, that somehow just was really special to be a part of like, not, releases are great and we celebrate them, but it's just really nice to like have that singular experience and not worry about like a video camera or photos and just like focus on the moment. So that's mine. But so yeah, releases are certainly the entire goal of rehabilitation. It's what we're trying to do for all these animals. We kind of touched on this a little bit before, but I guess I just want to ask, like, what does releasing animals mean to you? And I feel like that's kind of a weird question on the face of it, but yet it kind of comes back to that notion of you get a little bit attached to these animals, especially the ones who you've put so much care into. Like some of these animals we have for a long time, the bears, even animals like turtles we might have close to a year. So you pour so much of yourself into these animals and maybe get a little attached. So do you guys ever get sad? Is it ever bittersweet? Or really on the flip side, there's also this component of wild animals. It's not like they turn around and say thank you for all of your hard work, right? They're just like, get away from me, I gotta go. So I don't know, it's kind of a mixed bag, but what does a release mean to you?
I think you did encapsulate that well. It's very bittersweet. I, for one, love when they like turn around and get mad at me. I love when they give me those behaviors of like, I hate you. I'm like, good, I did my job. But I love seeing wildlife be in the wild, being what they are, doing what they're supposed to do. And that's what I want to instill in them. That's the skills and the platform I want to provide for them when I am rehabilitating them. So being able to release them, some of the best releases are ones that aren't even ones that we've had for a long time. I remember back when I was the intern, there was a loon that came in, and loons are one that we try to fast track right out the door. They are birds that they don't walk on land. They stay on the water at all times. So the longer they're in captivity, kind of the worse they can deteriorate more, and it impedes their release even further. So we got one out pretty quickly, and we had this really treacherous like walk down this icy mountain to this lake to release. But overall, it was like the greatest experience. That bird was so feisty. It was like flapping its wings into the face of the rehabber the whole way down to the lake. And we finally got it in the water, and it swam away, and it was the most eerily quiet winter day, but it did its loon call the whole way, like down the lake as it swam away. And that was the coolest thing to experience. And it just feels so good to know that that animal is back where it belongs. It's going to contribute to that environment and that ecosystem, and it is no longer stress-free. It's problem-free, and it's just where it's supposed to be. Yeah. So I love that.
Yeah, I don't think that they ever make me sad, because usually I'm excited for that animal to be back where it belongs, or I'm relieved because, oh, it had a really bad injury and somehow it miraculously healed from it and now it's going back. That's amazing. I'm never really sad to see them go, and I feel like the biggest thank you I can get from them is that they hate me and they want to be away from me. But it's probably my favorite thing to do. We've done, I'll probably do somewhat ridiculous things to release an animal back to where it belongs. We released a painted turtle recently within the past couple of months that getting down to the river, I kind of had to scramble down the riverbank, and I wasn't wearing the proper footwear, so I literally just barefoot walked down the side of an embankment to get this turtle back where it belongs. So I think just we're pretty dedicated to making sure animals go where they need to be, and so it's the best part of our job, and it never really leaves me with sadness, just happiness that they're back where they need to be.
I think the only time I feel bittersweet is when it's like ones we've had for a long time, or like our bears that we obviously like get this really cool, unique attachment to. But ultimately, I also want them to hate me when they chuff at me. Oh, I get so excited. I'm like, oh, that was terrifying, but like, good job. I'm so proud. Yeah. So that's, for me, that's the only like bittersweet part. But yeah, it's definitely the best overall. So it just makes us so happy to get them back out in the wild.
I think the saddest part is when I don't get to know what happens to them. Yeah. Like, I think that's the only part that makes me sad, is it's like, well, I'll never know if you make it or not. I hope you do. Not hearing is probably the best thing, but yeah.
Well, I think it goes without saying that we, but also our, thousands of viewers are so grateful for everything that you do, for all the wildlife that comes into your care. And of course, thank you for joining us on today's episode, this final episode for the season of Untamed Unfiltered. So thank you, Kelsey and Maz, so much for joining us today. And thank you all out there for joining us for this season of Untamed. And we will see you next time. Bye, everyone. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Love it.